Let's get you a green. Yeah, these are great. So this might be in terms of sitting.
These are great extensions to the stage, man. Yeah.
Here, put your drink right there. That's great. Does it taste a little beady right there? I think you're joking. All right. Okay.
Okay, eh?
Would you please welcome, by way of Kingston and Seattle, no, Portland, so, oh, sorry.
That's okay.
And would you please welcome David Schley.
Thank you, everybody. You're just the finest people to come here. I've got 3 pieces I was going to read, but I can just read a half of one. Hey, Gary. Everything good? One piece is a poem from a book published in 2021. I sent this to 9 publishers in Canada, and all of them didn't respond at all. Nothing. Not a whimper.
Yeah, at least you didn't get rejected. They didn't reject.
Well, I was just about to say that, so I took that as an omen because it didn't add to my rejection list. But I did send it to a small publisher in Portland who took it, and it's done pretty well. Not as well as this one, which was from 2017, which has done very well. You need this to be higher? Okay. Thank you, sir. So I'd like to read the final poem in this book, which is called Near Cold Fear. And what it is it's a effort to capture the mindset I'm left with, as Leonard Cohen would say, 3 a.m. on Saturday. Near Cold Fear. It's in 10 parts, so it takes a little while. 1. In Black Chasuble, the priest prays over them. He is ripe with folly, the spoils of simony under his red stole and white cincture. 2. To the arriving column, he shouts out goals. 1 more hill, 1 valley more, my sons. The last sacrament assured for every soul. Promises, too, that the Tigris, Euphrates, Pichon, and Gihon will assemble a new convergence just for them. 3. But they know this darksome delta burn of rogue weeds, silt, and wildness. They know its crafty serpent's rattle, for they are armed pilgrims shuffling into the valley neck of battle, where every old and best command crowds their ears and cracks their veins. 4. Once again they are comforted by an assembly of the saved, who gather for the fresh apocalypse, though their souls are stained by the sin of near cold fear. 5. The river just ahead falls inexorably into cold Nahash brimming sea, and around them like courtiers all the devils agree that the priest need not explain the fleeing idea of black. 6. Their tails stick out like comic beacons of an old idea. Their horns grow inwards to the center of a dark understanding. 7. From the hills, tranced syndics speculate, and in their savvy order every officer to concede the rout, its outcome so familiar, and to wipe all blood from the backs of their hands. 8. For they are peddlers who tally incessantly, document the trait and trace of every sortie, while indifferent gods nearby await their sums and stay busy binding desire in eloquent caution, dismissing every call for comity. 9. From their graveled verge, old men and women cry, I was once your father and your mother, and now, prisoners all, we march in brief right angles. 10. Later, when the battle subsides to silence, there come many maidens crying, do not die, I love you so. But still, they keep on dying. The end. That poem is an attempt to capture the idiocy of modern media mostly and religious chatter. It's also an attempt to talk about the unrelenting, repetitive, recurrent themes of human struggle. So that's from 2021 when this was published. This was a book from an earlier time, 2017 in the fall, and it's a book about love. And from the perspective of a rather foolish male, that would be me, trying to understand the vicissitudes and vagaries of relationships. Crusoe waiting. 50 sea nymphs, Nereides, reply suddenly from their grotto at the bottom of the whirled sea with you. And soothe again the vexed infinite ache of men who have crossed wide water with the petrel to where the sea licks the sand and in different cerulean waves bathe the naked feet of absent loves. My soul is coaxed to higher ground. Your arrival propels me immediately to stake this spot where you can do to me without apology what rare rain evokes in the brown desert. That you found me on this vast littoral accumulates into dense mystery, dares disturb the universe though we leave no scar at all. How miraculous your form, exactly the way I love the feminine. No small matter, my Itawa woman. We submit to a destiny of inevitable long kisses and understand as one clenched soul this geography of tense and person. I have so many stories for you, my rose-cheeked lover. Adrift in lonely latitudes, we are now far enough from the shaping line of earth and water to kiss urgently again. The storm conjured by Ustra flung us here. This wild coast is where we learn why your smile is my heart's home. Later, your eyes weep under the fierce sun. It's not the sun, you said. Talk about romantic love, like naivety on my part. Can't believe how much I had to learn, and it took me so long to learn it. One more poem from this one, and then I'd like to read you the prologue to a novel that I'm about just over 50% finished. Not by finished, I mean first draft. We know what that means. It's about only 4% finished. The Petrel and the Fletcher. We dispatched the ancient petrel far to sea, climb fast and high, and then descend again, we said. Hover as you do above a circle in the night. One day you will be our beacon, our compass in high, familiar light. Flight. When your vigil is complete and bidden back, we are to cross the Grimpen mire. Carry we will our long clenched love and the wisdom of the fire. The promise of the sonnet in us will make the journey too, through spaces treacherous, where like taxing stones in a river, there are those who may slow us or refuse to let us pass, but spring love aimed true by the feathers of an arrow from the mythic Fletcher's quiver will course fearless over all of that. For are we not conspirators, and is enchantment not our future? Though new witnesses may eschew the petrel's flight, or love as never sin, they will see by our eyes, however vexed to silence we were then, our flesh, our hearts now prove otherwise. Meaning, she said to him in endless answering, not yet, dear one, not here, not now, not alone. I could go on and on with poems like that are about unrequited love, but they're really just about figuring out who a man is in relation to a woman, a beloved. This is the prologue to the novel. I've got 400 pages done. It looks like it's going to be about 560, 580. It may end up being smaller. I'm not sure, because from the days when I began, it's become a very different kind of book. But I chose this prologue because it positions the book right here in this part of the world. Even though it's a book about 3 generations of a family in 2 continents in 9 countries, it's really a love story. It's really a story of redemption. Prologue, in which the reader learns how the story of the brothers came to be told. And the book is called The Brothers from Banat. And Banat is a province of western Romania, which at the time when this book began was a newly formed political part of Romania, wrestled from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. I don't know what you call these things when you put quotes at the top of a section, but I'll read you what Kathy Augustini, the niece of one of the main protagonists, had to say. Never say that Henry Steger left things to chance. He came to St. Peter's Colony in 1927. He wanted to farm his own land, lots of his own land, compared to the tired, ambiguous parcels for sale back home. In his gut, he knew that the odds were much better here. 160 acres, $10 fee, 3 years to get 40 acres cleared and a house built, and all of this by the end of 1931. He wanted to do all that. The prairie sky in those first few years reminded him every day of the Banat firmament. So that's a citation from an actual journal. And now the prologue. A 10-degree slope of prairie descends to the impenitent presence of Lake Flanor a few hundred meters west. I've been out here for an hour now. My index finger is tracing the faded rum lines on a little grassland sea portolan chart in dulled brown ink that Henry Steger made in 1928. I found it in a bottle, in the bottle green dispatch satchel he gave me to rummage through the summer I was 12. Its huge compartment and lockable front flap bulge this day with newspaper and magazine clippings, foolscap notes, letters, lists, telegrams, and photographs. His Croatian Pancala fountain pen and an old green glass ink bottle that looked like a turtle were in there too. The bottles dried out, leaving a dark brown powdery residue. That summer, he took me to the old fortress prison in Kingston to meet Jake. At the beginning, when I began piling up the detail of their lives, gluing everything into who I am, he and Jake were meanwhile aiming me at Lebenswahrheiten. They talked a lot about life ahead and life behind, that somewhere else was no better to be from than where I was, and that humans don't have dominion after all. Life truths, they said in so many words. Henry Steger was my grandfather. I picture him making that map and composing notes in Kurenschrift. All those letters, poems, and packets of drawings of machines, engines, and motor car radiators, Also in that satchel were 3 house plan renderings for this place, 5 miles from Lake Lenore Village in central Saskatchewan. One house plan included a list. He'd need 2,304 prairie grass bricks and 22 purlins to put up a soddy by Christmas 1928. The second drawing expanded the original with new wattle daub and lime rooms to be whitewashed with 6 pails of wood ash lye and water. And to get the best sun through the windows of the final prairie house he had started to build for Eva and his son before they came, he planted the footprint on an opportune southwest-facing promontory. The compass rose on his little map tells me that. On this tussocky slope I see and hear a handsome brown prairie chicken, buff and brazen, squawking at a jumble of boisterous grackles, trying to shoulder it aside, some carrion treasure, the cause of the fray. They don't notice me or wonder at all what I'm doing out here by their yonder shallow lake, sitting with my knees up and my hat pulled down on my forehead, hugging this slope. I inform those birds anyway that I'm circling back to one of the main stops in Henry and Jake's journey in their place of light, grasslands, and sky. There's a huge quartzite erratic rock not far away, dropped here by some ancient ice raft. All around it are knobs of igneous and phyllite and rounder, smaller rocks pushed up from the prairie soil. The big boulder is smothered in green-brown Iceland lichen. It must have looked the same when my grandfather worked this land. He probably found it impractical to move, or he would have. He no doubt moved plenty of smaller ones, though getting the land ready for marquee wheat with his Clydesdale and sled. He knew that there would be rocks every spring a few feet down in that magnificent, quiet plumbing system of the prairies, moving aside water and ground, queuing for winter cold and summer heat to help their skyward edging. From the dark rust iron post marking off the last mile before the lake, angled upwards in the center of 4 shallow pits, I calculate that I'm seeing the lake much as he would have. Nearby are remnants of a decayed stone boat, oddly abandoned so far down on this hill. What was on his mind alone way out here, except for when Jake rode in from Humboldt? He was younger then than I am now. Maybe he thought about how much caragana and gray dogwood slash he'd have to stack before carting it away or burning it off. Maybe he thought about what he left behind to get here at all. He would have looked ahead too. Unlike Jake, who was not much invested in proving up his quarter section, he would have been disciplined and focused on this work. He surely felt his friend's restlessness so soon, aware that moving toward another future in another place might be in the works for Jake, even though he himself had just got there. He knew Eva back home in Romania was waiting and preparing, and there was Robert, my father, too, to think about. Henry and Jake's lives, these brothers from Banat, were a busy equation of motion with only one degree of freedom available to them to go forward or backward, at whatever speed from wherever they were, time twice factored, constant velocity in time and space. They wanted me to make sense not only of all their fidgety wanderings, but also of the geography of blood, which was their destiny and through which they continually trekked. They reinvented themselves often in those years, these brothers from their abandoned land, who made a life in this new land, yanked away from the Cree, Nakota, Blackfoot, and Métis people at first, and then from the Chippewa, Anishinaabe, and Huron later. The record of what they did craves a reteller who can be counted on to report on their rhyming lives, not entirely rare, even marvelous sometimes. They told me that everything would all add up soon enough to old age for me too. Sometimes their stories felt like laments. Their complaint was, now that I think about it, all the possibilities and seductions which propelled them across an ocean and a new continent, turning out to be iterations of their old, own, worse world. That world's wars and injustices were an unrelenting fianchetto strategy for them, wretchedly bookending the first and second halves of their lives. Jake said that the second half had made no sense to him at all. I think they were telling me that they had settled for an emptier ending than they foresaw at the beginning. After so many traverse beginnings, it must have felt hollowed out. But sitting here on this lakeside slope in what was once known as St. Peter's Colony, I don't believe it really was either empty or senseless. And that's the end of a prologue to a 46-chapter book that is really a story of these brothers who began as engineers and steam fitters in the French tradition, not the German tradition, in Romania. Snapshotting the book, you'll find that Henry disappears in Chisinau, in modern-day Moldau. The Russian soldiers, in hasty retreat from Brusilov's attack from the north in 1916, took him prisoner. And he ended up in what is present-day Tajikistan, from which he escaped. And he came back to the village only to discover that Jake and others thought he had died. And Jake, called a kriptaka, which is a word for snake, Jake the snake, had taken off and left behind Elizabeth and a little child coming. There were other secrets of that kind, because Jake was a romantic kind of fellow, philanderer really. In any case, Henry followed him to North America. Jake has an interlude in Minnesota. For a number of reasons, ended up in Saskatchewan. Then they ended up in southern Ontario in the rum running business. And then one day, Jake, on Willette Avenue in Windsor, shot Bustamente, the Italian cobbler who was having an affair with his wife. And Jake turned the gun on himself and blew out the front of his face. He was blinded but not killed. And in the subsequent trial, which is really the beginning of the book, chapter 1, the jury determined that it was a crime of passion, and he was not hung, as would have been the case if it were first degree in those days. He was sent to prison for life, to Kingston, Ontario. And 20 years after he was sent there, I went with my grandfather as a 10-year-old on a trip to see him and meet him. And all his stories and my grandfather's stories accumulated into this book. And then there's a story of my grandfather's life in the Depression era, the rise of my father, his life as a seaman, a very skilled seaman. You may or may not know what Camp X is. If you do, then you know that that's a pretty special training depot in eastern Ontario, not far from Oshawa. There's a segment there, and there's a segment about Eugene, the narrator, finding his way out of being abandoned by the father's Bible experience with a woman named Cleopatra. And then the story of Eugene finding his father and finding his way to Saskatchewan. So it's quite an interesting story, and it's all about these two brothers who understood the pattern and sequence of life and wanted to impart it to this boy. One more poem and then I'll stop. This is a poem about another kind of love. It's called Sad Proscenium. His hands square a proscenium of forest and fast river. She moves into the frame, beckoned by the blurred bank opposite, where a little one watches. Mama, I'm here. The tiny whisper joining all their words, already set free on the water, skitting the riffles like whirl-a-gig beetles. She does not hesitate, bends, pulls the water in around her, swims headlong again toward the moment of birth, every pull of her arms and slash of her legs making for the farther shore. In the trees above, another figure gestures weakly. Thanks everybody for listening to my poems and my little bit of prose. I hope it all got captured, Gary.
Thank you, David. Play a few tunes.
I got drums.
Hey, Just gonna do a few interlude kind of tunes. See if I can get this whole thing in tune. Boy, this humidity is just doing a number on this old guitar. Let alone the down by the sea, where I met my lovely lady, oh, inside a dream. Saw you in the meadow, you're chasing butterflies, jump real high, look 'em in the eye, oh me, oh my, mind over matter. Oh, when you're head over heels, saw you in the meadow, you're chasing chasing butterflies. You jumped real high, looked him in the eye, and you said, hold me, oh mine, mine over matter. Oh, when your head over heels. Oh, mind over matter. Mind over matter.